Good evening, I'm Nima Rajan, and this is Forum Daily for Wednesday, June 8th. We begin our cast with a disappointing outlook from the OECD when it comes to the rising inflation hitting global economies. The Paris-based group says Russia's war in Ukraine and the energy and food crises it worsened will severely drag down global economic growth and push up inflation this year. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development says it expects the global economy to expand 3% this year, which is down from the 4.5% it had predicted in December. Inflation is forecast at nearly 9% for the OECD's 38 member countries, including Canada, which is nearly double the previous estimate. Meanwhile, Canada is imposing a new set of sanctions after the invasion of Ukraine. It introduced a ban on Canadian consultants, including advertising agencies, from working for Russian oil, gas, and chemical firms. The move is meant to further increase pressure on President Vladimir Putin's regime. The latest round of sanctions bans 28 types of consultants from working for Russia's oil, gas, and chemical sectors, which accounts for about 50% of its revenues. In a move to address the impact of residential schools in Canada, the federal government has named Kimberly Murray as its special interlocutor. The former executive director of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission will work with Indigenous communities to bring justice to Indigenous children and their families. Ms. Murray says she is committed to doing the work with humility, respect, honesty, and courage. The government announced the position last year after ground-penetrating radar detected hundreds of unmarked graves at former residential schools in British Columbia and Saskatchewan. The government is also looking to address greenhouse gas emissions by creating the country's first carbon offset market. Environment Minister Stephen Guilbeault says it would help big industry cut its greenhouse gas emissions. Carbon offset credits will be created when an entity, such as a municipality, a farmer, or a company, reduces its own emissions more than they have to. Companies that are paying the federal carbon price can then buy those credits to reduce the amount they have to pay. All right, switching gears here to the impacts of inflation on consumers, which has experts talking about shrinkflation. Consumer experts say shrinkflation isn't new, but something that comes in waves in times of high inflation. And one price watcher says we happen to be in a tidal wave at the moment. From toilet paper to yogurt and coffee to corn chips, manufacturers are quietly shrinking package sizes without lowering prices. Shrinkflation appeals to manufacturers because they know customers will notice price increases, but they won't keep track of net weights or small details like the number of sheets on a roll of toilet paper. Bird flu continues to affect Canada's poultry industry. The Canadian Food Inspection Agency is reporting more outbreaks of avian flu in British Columbia and Alberta. The outbreaks of the highly pathogenic avian influenza are in small flocks in 3 widely separated BC farms in Peace River, Seashelt, and Summerland. This brings the total number of infected farms in the province to 15. Outbreaks in 2 small flocks in Alberta push the total number of cases there to 31. In New Brunswick, the agency ended restrictions imposed following the discovery of the bird flu back in April. Meanwhile, Canadians seem to be flocking to discount retailers as soaring inflation drives prices higher. Montreal-based Dollarama is reporting a double-digit jump in customer traffic in its first quarter. Its profits rose from $113.6 million a year ago to $145.5 million. All right, turning to Manitoba now, where opposition New Democrats have retained a northern Manitoba constituency with a decisive by-election victory. Eric Redhead, a former chief of the Shamattawa First Nation, won the Thompson seat, defeating the only other candidate, Charlotte Larocque, who ran for the governing Progressive Conservatives. The Thompson seat has been vacant since the December death of New Democrat Danielle Adams, who was killed in a highway crash. The constituency has been won by the New Democrats in all but 2 elections since 1969. On the East Coast, Nova Scotia's government is teaming up with the Tourism Industry Association to develop a new strategic plan for tourism in the province. The province says it will establish a new vision for the sector, all while taking into consideration the needs of businesses and organizations, as well as traveler preferences and expectations. All right, stay with us. Forum Daily will be right back after the break with a look at the Summit of the Americas. We'll be speaking with an expert on that. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Leaders from the Western Hemisphere are gathering in Los Angeles today, including Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, for the latest edition of the Summit of the Americas. Mr. Trudeau started off the day with Barbados counterpart Mia Mottley talking about environmental priorities. A roundtable meeting with Latin American and Caribbean leaders was scheduled for later to discuss climate change, defending democratic values, and promoting gender equality. The summit has also drawn some criticism as the host country, the United States, decided not to invite Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba. Well, with us now is Dr. Maxwell Cameron, an expert in comparative politics specializing in Latin America. He has been accredited to participate in the Civil Society Forum and has been following this summit. Sir, welcome to Forum Daily.
Thank you very much.
So to start off, for our viewers, can you briefly give us a general idea of the purpose behind the Summit of the Americas?
Well, the summits are really an opportunity for the leaders, the prime ministers, presidents, and foreign ministers of the countries of the Western Hemisphere to gather together to tackle questions that can't be addressed unilaterally by each of our nations. So they're looking at things like climate change, green energy transition, governance of digital platforms, and of course, democratic governance. And these summits have been held, there have been 9 of them since 1994, when the first was held in Miami. This is the second time it's been held on US soil here in Los Angeles.
Some very important discussions happening right now, Doctor. So what have you been seeing so far at the summit?
Well, I've been involved in the Civil Society Forum, so I haven't been watching the leaders, but I've been participating in the process or observing the process of civil society groups, which have been tackling the same issues that the leaders are looking at. They've been working for months on putting together a statement about the kinds of things that they would like the leaders to do. And it's been quite a remarkable opportunity to observe their deliberations. And then we just came out of a session with the leaders, with Anthony Blinken, Secretary of State of the United States, and Melanie Joly. The civil society leaders had the opportunity to present to the leaders the issues that they think that our leaders across the hemisphere need to be addressing.
And what sorts of issues has your organization brought up with our leaders?
Well, there's a really intense concern about the human rights situation, and in particular in countries like Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua, with political prisoners, with repression, and more generally with backsliding, democratic backsliding that's happening right across the region. The growing importance of organized crime, corruption, movements of people, migratory movements that are caused often by problems of governance, but also with economic difficulties, these difficulties compounded by COVID. So there are many really pressing issues that are on the table in terms of governance. And there's a sense of urgency that our democracies have to demonstrate that we can actually get things done.
And the elephant in the room is the exclusion of Nicaragua, Venezuela, and Cuba. Now, we've been seeing some mixed reactions among world leaders. What about your society? Have you been seeing mixed reactions as well?
A little bit, but I would say that the overwhelming sense among the civil society participants here is that Nicaragua, Cuba, and Venezuela should not be included because they are not democracies. And in fact, it goes back to the Quebec City Summit in 2001, when the declaration that was made by the heads of state at that time indicated that countries that wanted to participate in the summits would need to be democracies in good standing. And clearly that's not the case with Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. So the mood here is that those leaders should be excluded. Now, of course, there has been a response on the part of Mexico and several other countries in the hemisphere, which is to say that everybody should be included, that all countries should be accorded respect for their sovereignty, and that it smacks of interventionism or US interference to not include them. Of course, it's the host country that does the inviting. And so I think this really comes down to a tension between whether you think state sovereignty is more important or popular sovereignty is more important.
All right, sir. So what are you hoping would be accomplished throughout this summit?
Well, they're going into the summit. The host country presented fairly strong, robust recommendations for improving democratic governance in the region, improving electoral integrity, the independence of electoral authorities, possibilities of good electoral observation, the right to vote, protecting journalists, protecting whistleblowers, and so forth. And so I would hope that those recommendations are not watered down and that we come out of this with at least a strong hemisphere in terms of protection of democratic governments as we did going into it.
We definitely share those hopes with you, Dr. Cameron. Thank you again for joining us today on Forum Daily.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Stay with us. Up next, as peak travel season approaches, we'll be discussing how Canadians can take extra precautions against monkeypox while on vacation. We'll be speaking with Dr. Abhishek Raut to learn just how risky it is to be traveling amid monkeypox cases and whether there are any countries that travelers should avoid for the time being. And of course, we'll have more news from around the world after that, so stay with us. We'll be right back with our weekly medical segment. People traveling outside of Canada are being urged to take extra precautions as monkeypox continues to be an issue. The Public Health Agency of Canada notes that the virus, typically only found in West and Central Africa, has cropped up around the world, with cases in Canada, the United Kingdom, Spain, and more than 24 other countries. They say it spreads mainly through close contact with the virus on other humans or objects, such as bed linens. While it can be fatal, it is most often not. Well, joining us now to give us his advice on staying safe while traveling in our weekly medical segment is Dr. Abhishek Raut, Medical Director at Appletree Medical Group. Dr. Raut, welcome back to Forum Daily.
Pleasure to be here.
So the government has issued a level 2 travel notice, urging travelers to take extra precautions while traveling. What do you think about this, Dr. Raut? Is this the right move right now?
Right. So we have 4 levels of travel health advisory. Level 1 really just reminds travelers to practice travel health precautions in their destinations, such as hand washing. Level 2, which is where we are with monkeypox, is an increased risk to travelers or certain groups of travelers, and reminds them to practice enhanced health precautions, sometimes personal protective equipment, and avoiding high-risk activities. Level 3 is basically avoiding non-essential travel, and level 4 is avoiding all travel whatsoever. So based on where we are with monkeypox, I think level 2 advisory is reasonable at this time.
So how risky is traveling at this time amid monkeypox and COVID-19?
Right. I mean, that's a very good point. Monkeypox is not an easily transmitted disease like COVID-19, and it does require prolonged contact with an infected person or even material for transmission. But the important thing is, as long as Canadians are taking these extra precautions while traveling, we don't really expect this to get too much worse.
So what kind of extra precautions should Canadians take while traveling?
Right. So the long and the short of it really is looking at washing your hands and wearing a mask. They're very good precautions for traveling. There are also very specific precautions, avoiding close contact with sick people, including those with skin lesions, avoiding contact with dead or live wild animals, especially small mammals such as rodents, rats, or squirrels, avoiding eating or preparing meat such as from wild game, and avoiding contact with contaminated materials used by sick people, such as clothing, bedding, or other materials in healthcare settings.
Now, it's interesting that we mentioned last week that it can spread from human to human, but it can also spread through beddings and clothing items. So should Canadian travelers consider packing their own bedding and washing them themselves?
I think that's a very good concern. We know that contact with objects or fabrics, including bedding, could be a possible source of infection for monkeypox. But as long as the beddings have been washed, we don't expect any significant concerns. So we have to just keep that in mind as well. If we're going to a place where we're not sure if the bedding is washed routinely, then it is better to pack your own beddings.
And what about water, Dr. Raut? We know some viruses can survive in water, so should Canadians avoid going in pools during their vacations?
Right. So there's always a risk with swimming pool illnesses. We see the diarrhea, gastrointestinal. We see a lot of respiratory issues, ear and skin infections from multiple organisms. We haven't heard too much about monkeypox in swimming or pools in general. If you're going to be swimming with multiple people abroad, keep in mind that there are, in fact, a host of different illnesses you could pick up. So, common sense, don't drink the water and take a shower before and after the pool.
And are there any other countries that Canadian travelers should avoid at this time? We know the UK has one of the biggest outbreaks outside of Africa, so should people avoid the UK?
So that's interesting. We now have about 28 different countries with travel advisories there, going all the way from Argentina, Australia to Mexico, Netherlands, the UK, United States, and UAE. I think what we're going to see is that list is going to increase, and it's going to be very similar to the level 2 that we have with COVID, which is all countries have a level 2 advisory.
All right, Dr. Raut, just in case you were to be infected, what sorts of medications and preparations should travelers consider in case they start displaying symptoms while traveling?
All right, so at this time, there are no specific treatments available for a monkeypox infection, but we know they can be controlled. We have good evidence that the smallpox vaccine is at least 85% effective in preventing monkeypox, and most countries will now look at giving that vaccine to people who they suspect have monkeypox to make it less severe.
All right, Dr. Raut, a lot of great advice there. Thank you again for joining us today on Forum Daily for our weekly medical segment. We'll see you again next week, Dr. Raut.
Thanks so much for having me.
Stay with us. Of course, we've got more news from around the world after a short break. Russian forces continue their offensive in eastern Ukraine. UNICEF warns about the large number of child deaths that will occur in Africa if the world hesitates to take action. Pedestrians in a Berlin shopping district were mowed down by a driver, killing at least one person and injuring many more. And nuclear tensions could soon be on the rise in Iran. We'll have these stories and more news right after the break, so stay tuned. We'll be right back. But in the meantime, check our website and follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Ukrainian forces battling Russian troops in the key eastern city of Severodonetsk appear to be on the cusp of retreat. But the regional governor insists they are still fighting for every centimeter of the city. Russian forces are also closing in on control of the entire Luhansk region, which makes up half of the industrial heartland known as the Donbass. After a bungled attempt to overrun Kyiv in the early days of the war, Russia shifted its focus to the region of coal mines and factories. Meanwhile, Russia and Turkey have backed a maritime corridor in order to export Ukrainian grain to global markets to help the world food crisis. Turkey's foreign minister hosted his Russian counterpart in Ankara for talks on a United Nations proposal. It was to free Ukraine's Black Sea ports and allow 22 million tons of grain currently sitting in silos to be shipped. Ukraine has expressed concerns that removing mines from its ports could allow Russia to attack its southern coast. But Ukraine was not invited to the talks. A Turkish minister also said Western sanctions should be lifted against Russia to allow the grain to be exported. Well, all of this comes as UNICEF is warning there will be an explosion of child deaths in the Horn of Africa if the world focuses only on the war in Ukraine and doesn't act now. A drought comes and goes in the region, but for the first time, a fifth straight rainy season might fail. Millions of livestock that provide families with milk, meat, and wealth have died. UN agencies say more than 200,000 people in Somalia face catastrophic hunger and starvation. This is a drastic increase from the 81,000 forecast in April. All right, moving to the Middle East now, as nuclear tensions could soon be rising. Iran has flipped the switch on a pair of surveillance cameras, which allow the United Nations nuclear watchdog to keep an eye on one of the Islamic Republic's atomic sites. It comes as Western nations seek to censure Iran at a meeting this week of the International Atomic Energy Agency. The Vienna-based agency did not immediately acknowledge Iran's move, and it has not responded to a request for comment from the Associated Press. Outcry in Nigeria. Women marched in protest in the town of Owo on Tuesday. This comes after the attack on a Catholic church 2 days earlier. At least 38 people were killed, including 5 children. Police say some of the at least 5 gunmen were disguised as congregants when they carried out the attack during Sunday Mass. Authorities haven't made any arrests yet. In Germany, rescue services say a man has driven a car into pedestrians in a popular Berlin shopping district, killing at least 1 person. 9 people were hurt, all of whom sustained serious injuries. After the driver got back on the road, he crashed into a shop window around a block further on. Police have detained the driver, and they currently believe that this event was a deliberate act conducted by what they're calling a psychologically impaired person. Disgraced film producer Harvey Weinstein is going to be charged with 2 counts of indecent assault against a woman in London in 1996. The Crown Prosecution Service says it authorized the charges against the 70-year-old. This was following a review of evidence gathered by London's Metropolitan Police. Mr. Weinstein is serving a 23-year sentence for sexual assault. This was after his 2020 conviction in New York for offenses against 2 women. He is awaiting trial on charges that he assaulted 5 women in Los Angeles and Beverly Hills from 2004 to 2013. Meanwhile, U.S. Olympic gold medalist Simone Biles and about 90 other women are suing the FBI. They were sexually assaulted by Larry Nassar and are seeking more than $1 billion from the FBI for failing to stop the sports doctor. FBI agents in 2015 knew that Mr. Nassar was accused of assaulting gymnasts, but the agents did not open a formal investigation or inform Michigan authorities. This left Mr. Nassar free to continue targeting young women and girls for more than a year. Individual lawsuits could follow, depending on the FBI's response. And a permanent virtual exhibit of one of France's most famous prehistoric sites, the undersea Koski Cave, has opened its doors. This comes as concerns grow that the cave could be completely inundated as a result of rising tides driven by climate change. Visitors to the port city of Marseille are able to see the display. It's a replica of the over 30,000-year-old site with copies of the prehistoric paintings that made the cave internationally famous. The Koski Cave was discovered in 1985 by diver Henri Koski in deep waters off the Marseille coastline. All right, that'll do it for your look at national and international news. Take care, Canada. We'll see you next time on Forum Daily.